Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So if you've been home labbing for any particular amount of time, one of the things that you are very aware of is that you use your internet connection for connectivity for people to connect to your various services. Or even if you're the only one that connects to them, you will probably connect to them remotely. That being the case, your internet service connection is extremely important. Today, we want to talk about an application by Alex Justison, which is called Speedtest Tracker. Speedtest Tracker was initially released in September of 2022, and as of June 1st of 2025, it is at version 1.6, and the last release was 2 weeks ago from when I made this video. Most all of us in the home lab environment have used a very simple Docker container by the name of Open Speedtest, and it's handy to measure speeds between a server on your network and perhaps another server on your network, or perhaps the access remotely to your network. This one's a little bit different, and it's really designed to measure the speed of your ISP connection. It has a number of features, and I like everything that I've seen so far. Let's head over to my dashboard for Speedtest Tracker, and I name my dashboard Scotti-BYTE Speed Test. And it's a really highly customizable program. The basic idea is it performs speed tests on a particular schedule that you define. You see here it says that the latest download was 1.67 gigabits per second. The latest upload speed was 357 megabits per second, and the latest ping was 13 milliseconds. And so we can see charts of the various speed tests. I can move around to see exactly what a particular speed test performed at. Same thing with the upload speed, same thing with the ping, and also the jitter, which is important for things like VoIP applications. And then we have download latency and upload latency. If we go over here to the results menu, it's really the same thing. It shows you when speed tests were performed and which server those speed tests were performed against. We then have a section for API tokens. We can create an API token so that we can query what the speed test results were from the most frequent or most recent speed test. And then we can also initiate a speed test from another server with the API. In the data integration section, you have the option to integrate this application with an Influx database. And then you have a section for notifications. And in my particular case, I have my notifications set up to go to Gotify. It also supports Entify, and I read in the release notes where the authors are going to try to support Apprise, which I think really makes sense since Apprise supports about 60 different notification mechanisms. You then have a section for thresholds where you can describe particular thresholds of what speed you're expecting, and then you can get notifications outside of those thresholds. I have not set those on my particular system. Then you have the users area, and you have an admin user when you first create the program, and you can also create other users that I suppose only have the ability to initiate speed tests but not create other users. Then you have a section for documentation, and all great self-hosted software usually has an opportunity to donate to the developer for the hard work that they do, and then he has a link to his GitHub page. In the upper right hand corner, I can also click on speed test where it will initiate a speed test, and This is a speed test on demand as opposed to the speed tests that are performed on the schedule, which is something that we'll go over when we configure the program. So if I select a speed test server, I can go down here and select anything I want. Let's select this Comcast server here in Houston, Texas. I do a start and it starts the speed test. And now you can see that the results have come back from that speed test where we chose the server to test against to be that Comcast server. If I go back up to my dashboard here, it says that right now I got a download speed of 1.5 gigabits, which is 10% slower than I suppose my last speed test that was performed about an hour ago. And then my upload speed is just a little bit faster, and my ping speed was just a little bit slower. And you'll see now that we have an additional data point here. So the more information you have, the better. But this is going to be a great program to test to see whether you're experiencing an improvement or a degradation in the speed of your internet connection. One of the things that I really appreciate about utility programs like this is if they have a notification mechanism. And as I showed you earlier in the notifications section, we have the ability to specify a notification system. So here I have my Gotify, and you can see that it is tracked responses from the Speedtest Tracker server. In this particular case, it says that it bounced off of Comcast, and it says what the ping was, what the download was, what the upload was, and you can even go ahead and click on the link for the results from the Ookla speed test, and it'll go ahead and show you up here which speed test statistics you had, although I don't know why you'd want to do that, because you would have to be looking at the advertisements. And then you have this other link down here, which is just a link on my server to show the actual results, which will open my app. And so I have a couple of speed tests that are listed in here, and I'll typically delete old notifications, but this allows me to see how my speed tests have been performing without actually entering the program. So with that in mind, let's go over and see how we can install and configure Speedtest Tracker. Speedtest Tracker is a Docker application, but I like to nest my Docker applications inside of an Incus container as what I consider to be a best practice. And part of the reason for that is because it gives me one clean object, meaning an Incus container, that I can back up and restore and take snapshots of. Whereas if I wanted to do the same thing and had multiple applications on one Docker server, I would not have exactly that situation. So here I'm doing an Incus launch images, Ubuntu 2404, Speedtest Tracker with the default profile and the bridge profile. If you haven't seen Incus before, or you're not familiar with an Incus server, go watch my video entitled Incus Containers Step by Step. Also, that's where I introduce the concept of the bridge profile, which takes your container and offers it out on your main LAN. And I'm setting boot.autostart equals to true, which means that when the Incus server starts, this container starts. And then security.nesting is set equal to true. The reason for that is so that I can nest a Docker container inside of an Incus container. One of the questions I get frequently on the channel is, well, gee, if you have OCI containers, why not just create an OCI container? And generally my guidelines for whether I choose to nest a Docker application inside of an Incus container or just use an OCI container is when the application has, first of all, a single container, and secondly, if it is simple enough. Otherwise, there are pieces of the application all over your system, and it defeats the purpose of trying to simplify management. Now that we've created our Incus container, I'm going to go ahead and do an Incus shell into Speedtest Tracker. and that moves you into the root account of the container, since at this point we don't have any other usernames. Next, we're going to go ahead and take all the updates and any upgrades to operating system components by doing an apt update and an ampersand apt upgrade. And once that's completed, we will install the dependencies for this particular Docker container, which is pretty much the dependencies that we find for just about any Docker container that I install inside of Incus. I'm putting the curl command in because the script that we run to install Docker requires curl. I'm putting net-tools in because it's convenient to do a lot of network commands. I'm adding the nano editor, and I'm adding OpenSSH server so that we can go ahead and SSH into the container instance for maintenance later on. Now that the basic dependencies are installed, let's go ahead and install Docker from the script on the Docker website. Now that we have our dependencies installed, let's go ahead and add myself a username with an add user Scott. We'll go ahead and give Scott a password and verify that password. Next, I'm going to go ahead and put Scott into the sudo group with usermod -a capital G sudo Scott. And likewise, I'm going to go ahead and put Scott in the Docker group so that I don't have to use sudo to submit Docker commands. Let's su over to the Scott account with an su space Scott. And now that we're over here, let's go ahead and make the screen just a little bit larger font. And then we're going to go ahead and make a folder called Speedtest Tracker. Now that we have the folder Speedtest Tracker, let's go ahead and move inside it. For those of you that wonder why I always create a folder here, it's just for organization and for symmetry in terms of how I create all of my applications. Let's go ahead and create our Docker Compose file, and in this particular case, I'm simply going to call this compose.yml. This Docker Compose file is pretty simple because all the magic is going to be in an environments variable file. But basically, we have the image we're running, the name of the container, the fact that we're using an env file that's called .env, and then we're setting up the environment variables for the PUID and the PGID, which will allow this Docker container to not run under root, but instead run under the user account of the Incus container. And then I'm creating a folder which is simply called ./data, which means we have a data folder in the same directory as we do with the compose.yml file. We're exposing port 80 for the web interface, and we're doing a restart unless stopped. And then we'll do a Control-O and Enter to write the file out, and a Control-X to exit the nano editor. Next, we want to go ahead and create ourselves an application key for data encryption with this command, which will be in the show notes. And then once we get that value, we want to go ahead and select that entire value from the beginning of that line out all the way to the equal sign. And then I'll go ahead and do a copy. Next, I want to do a nano on the .env file, which I created in advance. And here we have our env file. The first thing we want to do is go in here and do a Shift-Control-V to put in the application key that we just created. There are many variables in this environment variables file. The very first one at the top is the application name, and as you will recall, my production version, I had renamed mine to Scotti-BYTE Speedtest. The next thing we have here is the application environment as production. We want to leave that the same, and the application debug mode as false. The next one is the application URL, and that's going to be http://localhost. Let me go ahead and do a Control O and hit enter to write the file out, and a Control X to exit the nano editor. At this point, I'm going to do an ifconfig command, and I see that ETH0 has the address of 172.16.1.192 in my case. And so I'm going to go back into my editor session, come down here, and then remove localhost and go ahead and paste that value in here of 172.16.1.192. Now, if you were hosting this through Nginx Proxy Manager using a reverse proxy and using a domain name, you could easily say https:// your subdomain name, and that's what I've done in my case, where my URL is https:// speedtest.scotti-BYTE.com. The next line in this file is your speed test schedule, and that uses a standard format for cron, or run on the clock capabilities, and in this particular case it runs every 6 hours round the clock beginning at midnight. So I have 4 speed tests per day. The next section is providing the PUID and the PGID, which basically means the group and user ID for the user that we want this to run under. And if you created an Incus container, we're actually creating the second user ID because the first one is Ubuntu. When I created the Scott user ID, it has the user ID of 1001 and the group ID of 1001. After a lot of testing, I discovered that you really needed to do this in order to make the application run properly. Next, I have my application locale and my application fallback locale. If you are in another location, you might want to change that. And then I have my application time zone. In my particular case, I'm in the America/Chicago time zone, which means the Central time zone. I also set something called the display underbar time zone, and it would be set to the same value. The program internally uses SQLite, but I discovered that unless I specify DB underbar connection equals SQLite, I had issues. And I also had to provide the database path inside the container, which is /config/database.sqlite, and you should leave that the same. And then we have the application maintenance driver and the application maintenance store, which is a database. And then I'm not sure whether I needed this PHP workers. I noticed this to be a default on other people's Docker composes that they use for this program. We've got some other values in here. None of them are really all that important, but I put them in here so that you're aware of them. This last section for mail, I don't currently have set, but if you set up your own mail server that you use, then the mail notification from within the program will work. Personally, I did not want to use email to send my results out because I would rather look at them in something like Entify or Gotify. At this point, we'll go ahead and do a Control O and enter to write the file out, and a Control X to exit the nano editor. Just as a reminder, if I do an ls-al, you'll see that we have the compose.yaml file, and then we have the .env file that we created. Now to start the program, we simply do a docker space compose up space -d to make it detached, which means that it will run after we log out. It goes ahead and pulls down the Docker overlay layers, creates the container, and starts the container. We can see the running container by doing a docker ps, and then we can see how it started and whether or not it is doing everything that we want it to do by doing a docker compose space logs. And the program started up. It is correctly running at user ID 1001 and group ID 1001. It's generating a self-signed certificate, putting it in keys, and then it goes ahead and says everything is done. At this point, I can go ahead and head back to my Chrome browser here. I'll open a new tab and I will simply paste in the IP address of the container, and it brings up this setup screen. We're going to go ahead and click the first option for sign in and admin panel. At the login screen, we're going to enter the initial default credentials, and those are admin@example.com for the email address, and then the password is literally password all in lowercase characters, and then you click sign in. The first thing to do once you've signed in is to go over here to this A icon, which stands for the username of admin@example.com. Go ahead and click it and click profile. In the profile screen, you can change the username, and I'll go ahead and change it to Scott. And then I'll go ahead and change it to my email address, which actually becomes the thing that I use to log in with. And then I'm going to go ahead and type in a new password here, if I can get this correct. And then I'll tab down and it brings up a new password field, which I guess I actually have to click in. And I'll go ahead and type that in and do a save changes. At this point, I can go ahead and log out of Speedtest application by clicking over here and saying sign out. I can now provide the new email address and the new password that I entered and click sign in again. And now we have an S up here indicating user Scott. At this point, the next automated speed test is set up to be June 1st, 2025 at 6 p.m. according to what we put into the env file. But I can run a speed test on demand by simply clicking speed test over here, and that goes ahead and opens an option allowing me to choose a server. If I click this pull down, it will go ahead and find the closest servers to me. I'll go ahead and pick this one in Baytown, Texas, and I'll click start. And that will go ahead and initiate a speed test. After just a few seconds, I headed over to the results page, and you can see that this speed test has been completed. If I go back to the dashboard, we see that we have speed test results here, and these results are a little bit slower, especially the latest ping. So maybe I didn't pick the greatest speed test server to bounce off of. Let's go ahead and click speed test again. And this time I'll go ahead and pick the Comcast server, which would be the default at the top of the list. It's now initiated another speed test. If I go down here to results, it was running and it should be completed shortly. And now the Comcast speed test has been completed, and I go back up here to the dashboard, and sure enough, this speed test was 21% faster, and also it was ever so slightly faster on the upload, but the latency was considerably better here. I really think that Speedtest Tracker is a great application to add to the home lab, particularly if you're hosting a lot of services and you want to know what your ISP performance actually is. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit your notification bell, and we'll see you next time.